I think
medical perspective.
Yeah. I think there's a problem, however. I wish that medicine and public health didn't split. See, it's two separate worlds. And most doctors don't know enough public health. And a lot of public health people, not that there's anything wrong with that, aren't medical people. They're epidemiologists and statisticians and community health people and so forth. But I really wish that the fields were closer together. And so one of the things that I try to do is bridge that. At my university, I'm both a professor of public health and a professor of medicine.
Doctora Guadalupe, bienvenida. No te escuchamos.
Buenas tardes, ¿cómo estás, Guillermo? ¿Cómo estás?
Bienvenida,
Rebeca.
doctora Guadalupe. Dr. Fran, let me introduce you to Dr. Guadalupe.
Renata,
You know her?
Rebeca, ya te cambié el nombre.
Hola, buenas tardes, doctora. Gusto
Buenas
verla.
tardes.
Igual.
Doctora, ¿tú conoces al Dr. Fran? Claro, por supuesto.
Sí,
Have you ever met before to Dr. Guadalupe, Dr. Fran? Have you met her
I know
before?
her name and I know her work. I'm not sure we've actually ever met.
Ok. Bueno, un placer tenerlos a todos. Podemos
Claro.
seguir avanzando con la traducción, ¿cierto? Gracias, Jake. Doctora, nos damos unos 5 minutitos mientras esperamos que llegue más público.
ok, sí.
Podemos arrancar a las 6:05, ¿te parece?
Sí, me parece bien.
Ok. 5 minutes to go, Dr. Fran.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Give people a few minutes to join. It's early there for me. It's later in the evening. After dinner for me, before dinner for most of you, I would presume.
Yeah.
Different cultures.
Yeah.
And since tomorrow started a holiday weekend in Mexico.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
We have a long weekend.
Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 4 days in holidays.
So we may not have that many people tonight because of that.
Probably.
No, because holidays start tomorrow. So today we are supposed to be working.
Yeah, but it's evening time and you can get a start on the holiday a little bit.
Do you know who is
But
in
the
the
thing
screen?
is that it.
Dr. Fran, do you saw him?
Excuse me?
Do you saw him who is in the screen?
Do I see what's on the screen?
Hello, Arthur.
Oh,
Hello. Hi, Sean.
Hi. I'm in a break and a deposition. They still got me going this late.
oh, good
Sorry.
grief.
Break a leg.
Yeah, I'll do my
Thank
best.
you. Hi, Miguel.
Oh, how are you?
Fine. How are you?
¿Cómo va ese laboratorio?
Fine.
Muchas
Yeah.
pruebas.
Yep. A lot of
¿Qué
stuff
es lo
going
que,
on.
qué se ve al fondo, lo que me acabaste de mostrar? ¿Qué es?
La
Es
campana, ¿no? De flujo laminar.
Pana de extracción con HEPA filter. Ahí es donde está Sean analizando las muestras de Colombia.
Wow.
Okay. ¿Ahí qué se determina?
Ahí estamos buscando asbesto, pero por PLM.
Ok. Crocidolita, crisotilo, ¿sí?
Ujú. Sí, y acá está el TEM, pero está apagado la luz. No sé si lo alcanza a ver.
Sí.
Pero ya no los distraigo.
Muy bien. Bienvenido, Miguel.
Gracias.
Tú no me pasaste el contacto de la persona de la Universidad de México.
Ahorita te lo paso. Dame. A él sí se lo pasé. Se me hace que se me olvidó pasártelo a ti.
Miguel
Sí.
tiene contactos con una universidad. ¿En dónde es que es?
La Universidad de Montemorelos en Nuevo León, México.
¿Y hacen determinaciones de asbesto y caracterización de asbesto?
No, nada de eso. Están verdes en eso. Yo me gradué de allí y unos compañeros de la escuela ahora son ya pues directivos, ya hace de eso casi 30 años que yo me gradué. Y
Ya.
uno de ellos es director de la escuela de medicina y otros son pues profesores ahí. Y estoy tratando de incentivarlos a unirse a las pláticas, aunque sea nada más como espectadores. Si hay algo más que puedan hacer, pues ya será cosa de ellos. Yo tiene mucho tiempo que salí de ahí y pues ahora trabajo acá en Estados Unidos con Sean Fitzgerald.
¿Tú eres mexicano?
Claro, a mucha
Ok.
honra.
¿De Nuevo León?
Sí, de Monterrey, Nuevo León.
Ah, ok. Hay una gente que nos va a hacer la caracterización y la determinación de asbesto en la Universidad de San Luis Potosí.
¿Oh, sí? No
Sí,
conozco
tienen
nadie
el
por ahí.
equipo y tienen los teles, todos los equipos para hacer la determinación de cuántas fibras, pero también tienen para hacer la caracterización.
Oh, qué bueno, no tenía idea de eso. El único
Sí.
TEM, microscopio de transmisión que conocía
Ajá.
yo estaba en la Universidad de Nuevo León, en la Autónoma de Nuevo León. Pero le digo, de eso
No,
ya tiene más de
fíjate que
25 años.
también tienen en la Facultad de Geología de la UNAM, también lo
Oh, sí.
tienen, porque a
Sí,
nosotros nos hicieron una caracterización.
sí, si la tienen en la Autónoma de Nuevo León, la tienen que tener allá ustedes en la UNAM. Digo, ustedes, no sé si usted está en México, en la capital.
Sí, en la Ciudad de México.
Sí, sí. Generalmente ya cuando nos llega a nosotros a las otras partes del país es porque la UNAM lo tiene. Eso es bien sabido.
Claro.
A ver.
Dr. Fran,
Yes.
below the screen, the Zoom screen, you can activate the button for the
Yeah,
translation.
I'll share my slides. I just want to.
For the translation into English.
You know,
Can hit a button.
I won't need the translation.
But we are going to be
Later.
speaking in
Okay.
Spanish.
Yeah, so.
Doctora Guadalupe, cuando tú quieras.
Ok, empezamos. Bueno, pues muchas gracias por estar todos en el seminario de esta sesión donde Guillermo ha invitado a gentes muy interesantes y muy importantes para tratar el tema del asbesto. Entonces yo nada más les voy a platicar un poquito de qué es el proyecto. El proyecto es un proyecto multidisciplinario que aprobó el Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología y que se está desarrollando en el Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social del Centro Médico Nacional Siglo XXI, en la Unidad de Investigación de Salud en el Trabajo, donde se está buscando, una de las cosas que se está buscando es evaluar biomarcadores en una corte. Sí, dime. ¿Más despacio? Ok. Me arranqué. Ok. Entonces, el proyecto es un proyecto sobre evaluación de biomarcadores para tamizaje que se va a aprobar en una corte de una población trabajadora y ambientalmente, no solo expuesta ocupacionalmente, sino también expuesta ambientalmente a fibras de asbesto por una empresa que estuvo de 1943 a 1993 en una comunidad que se llama San Pedro Barrientos. Similar a lo que pasó en Casale Monferrato, que el doctor Frank conoce muy bien el caso. Y entonces en esa población se va a estudiar durante 3 años consecutivos estos biomarcadores que son para evaluación de si podemos hacer pruebas de tamizaje para la población expuesta ambientalmente y ocupacionalmente al asbesto. Y este proyecto también tiene otros aspectos que cubrir, como son el aspecto de incidencia, de educación y de capacitación. y crear organización en la comunidad. En la comunidad ya hay una pequeña organización, pero también de lo que se trata es de consolidar esa organización de los habitantes para que luchen por sus derechos y se incorporen a una lucha en contra del asbesto en México, que como usted sabe, doctor, no está prohibido en México, al igual que no está prohibido en Estados Unidos. Entonces, ese objetivo tiene este proyecto de caminar hacia allá con una comunidad que ha estado expuesta ocupacionalmente. La empresa ya no está, ya se fue, pero hemos visto un incremento de las muertes por mesotelioma pleural, peritoneal y cáncer pulmonar en esta comunidad. Entonces, por eso se seleccionó esta comunidad para hacer un trabajo durante 3 años y consolidar tanto la organización como ver si los biomarcadores, que son 2 proteínas, mesotelina y calretinina en sangre, pueden servir como biomarcadores de tamizaje. Ya se demostró que sirven como biomarcadores de diagnóstico temprano. Entonces, queremos ver si nos pueden servir como biomarcadores de tamizaje, y se está en colaboración con el doctor Jonen, que está en el IPA, en el Instituto de Prevención de Accidentes de Alemania, en la ciudad de Bochum. Entonces ellos nos están mandando el biomarcador de calretinina, que es uno de los que vamos a medir en el proyecto. Entonces, pues de manera general, en eso consiste el proyecto que se está desarrollando en México, y que Guillermo también está colaborando en la parte más de educación y capacitación. Por eso estos seminarios que amablemente él ha podido organizar con todos los contactos que tiene. Entonces, pues de eso se trata estos seminarios, y espero que sean de mucha utilidad, y le agradecemos mucho. Ahorita Guillermo lo va a presentar a usted, su currícula vitae, para que la gente y el público lo tenga conocido antes de que presente. Muchas gracias.
Muchas
Thank you very
gracias, doctora Guadalupe. El doctor Arthur Frank es médico de la Escuela de Medicina del Monte Sinaí en la ciudad de Nueva York en 1972. Doctorado en Ciencias Biomédicas de la Universidad de Nueva York en 1977. Estudió y trabajó con Irving J. Selikoff, el médico que destapó los problemas del asbesto en Estados Unidos. Es profesor titular de Salud Pública del Departamento de Salud Ocupacional y Ambiental de la Universidad de Drexel en Filadelfia, Pensilvania. Sus estudios sobre patogénesis, fisiología y epidemiología del cáncer de pulmón y del mesotelioma, sobre la interacción celular del asbesto in vitro, sobre la actividad biológica in vitro del crisotilo comparado con otras fibras anfíbolas, sobre observaciones clínicas de las consecuencias sobre la salud humana que siguen a la exposición al asbesto, sobre asbesto como agente de contaminación ambiental y sobre análisis mineralógicos del asbesto como indicador carcinogénico, lo convierten en toda una autoridad en la materia. En el año de 2016 recibió el premio Ramazzini del Colegio Ramazzini por su distinguido historial de investigación en salud y seguridad en el trabajo, así como su defensa y servicio en la promoción de una mejora de la seguridad y la salud en el trabajo en los países en desarrollo y en la lucha internacional por prohibir el uso del asbesto. El doctor Arthur Frank hace parte de una extensa red de investigadores y científicos que desde la academia develan las enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto para proteger la salud humana y ayudar en la prevención de los riesgos que la exponen a enfermedades incurables. Como comisionado oficial del Servicio de Salud Pública de los Estados Unidos, llevó a cabo investigaciones en el Instituto Nacional del Cáncer. Sus principales actividades de investigación incluyen el estudio de las enfermedades laborales pulmonares como asbestosis y silicosis, cáncer profesional, especialmente los relacionados con la exposición al asbesto. Fundamentado en sus conocimientos sobre el tema, considera que la ciencia debe dar pasos hacia acciones positivas que busquen la prohibición mundial del asbesto. Esta presentación de hoy tiene una especial connotación desde el punto de vista personal, porque con total seguridad puedo decir, y los miembros de la Fundación Colombia Libre de Asbesto podemos decir, que sin el apoyo decidido del doctor Arthur Frank, probablemente la prohibición del asbesto en Colombia hubiera tomado un rumbo diferente al que tomó. Su amplio conocimiento y su reconocida autoridad internacional fue escuchada en múltiples escenarios, como las facultades de medicina de diferentes universidades, el Parlamento colombiano, las emisoras de radio y los periódicos, ferias del libro y centros especializados como el Instituto Nacional de Cancerología y el Hospital de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, la más importante universidad pública del país, en un trabajo permanente a lo largo de 5 años, cuando lo conocí por primera vez personalmente en las conferencias de asbesto, arte, ciencia y política en el año de 2014 en Bogotá, hasta el año de 2019, cuando incluso recorrimos en un esfuerzo de pedagogía las oficinas de los congresistas del Senado en Colombia, explicándoles a los escépticos la importancia de que Colombia prohibiera el asbesto. Gracias a este respaldo, contribuimos con evidencia para develar el impacto del asbesto en los trabajadores de la industria del sector de fricción. Publicamos el libro Asbesto en Colombia, Fundamentos para el Debate, libro que distribuimos a todos los congresistas del Parlamento colombiano. Y gracias a su decidido respaldo, realizamos el primer taller en Colombia de entrenamiento en guías para la clasificación radiológica internacional en neumoconiosis de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo 2011, en compañía de los colegas de Brasil, liderados por el doctor Eduardo Algranti, en representación de Fundacentro, para contribuir en la ruta diagnóstica de las enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto, un tema crítico en nuestros países frente al alarmante subregistro de estas patologías. Como bien lo dice el doctor Frank, la ausencia de datos no quiere decir que haya ausencia de enfermedad. Si, como dice el doctor Frank, la ciencia debe dar pasos hacia acciones positivas que busquen la prohibición mundial del asbesto, esta igualmente requiere de la integridad de personas dispuestas a convertir esa promesa en una realidad. Nuestro invitado de esta noche cumple a cabalidad con tal propósito. Antes de cederle la palabra a nuestro invitado, queremos decirle que contamos con traducción simultánea en la parte inferior de su ventana a esta conferencia por Zoom, y para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas les recomendamos que las hagan llegar por el chat de esta misma conferencia. Bienvenidos a todos, bienvenido doctor Frank, y muchas gracias por aceptar amablemente nuestra invitación. Señoras y señores, con ustedes el doctor Arthur Leonard Frank. Adelante, Frank.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, for that kind and too full introduction. But it's truly an honor for me to be with you and our colleagues in Mexico that are interested in the issue of asbestos. And with not much further ado, I would like to plan to take everybody on a trip with me this evening and to talk about asbestos. So what we have here is what I would like to talk about is why is it such a big deal, such an important issue to talk about asbestos? And the trip we're going to take is from the laboratory to the bedside to the population and maybe even a bit beyond. I'm sure after these various seminars, you've understood what asbestos is. It's a series of 6 fibers in 2 families, the serpentine form called chrysotile, That's the one that worldwide had about 90 to 95% of its use. And I would think including in Mexico for the kinds of products that were made there. The other 5% are made up of predominantly 2 of the 5 amphibole fibers, chrysotolite and amosite. This is a slide from an autopsy done in the year 1899. And here I'm pointing to, it's a little hard to see, but there's an asbestos body. This is a fiber of asbestos that was coated with an iron and protein matrix. And it was found at the autopsy of a 36-year-old young man who told the doctor who was caring for him and who did his autopsy that 10 young men had started less than 10 years previously at an asbestos textile factory in the East End of London. And he related to his physician, Dr. Montague Murray, that all 9 of his mates had passed away previously, and he was the 10th and last, all of them now having died of respiratory insufficiency, what we would now call, because it's caused by asbestos, asbestosis. That name didn't come into being till, about 20 years later in 1924. The world's production of asbestos is still around 2 million tons. At least half of it comes from Russia. Other major producers have shut down: South Africa, Canada, Brazil. But there is still a great deal of use. Half the world's use is in India and China together. Other countries are still major users. And we know from data from the World Health Organization and others that it is estimated in the world that there are about 250,000 deaths from asbestos on a yearly basis. About 70 countries have totally banned the use of asbestos. As Dr. Aguilar correctly pointed out, the United States is not one of them. And of course, nor is Mexico. Mexico is still a country that uses many thousands of tons of asbestos, makes a variety of products, which it both uses internally and can sell elsewhere. And whatever assistance I can bring to our friends and colleagues in Mexico to help you rid Mexico of this material, I would pledge myself to do that, as I've done with Guillermo in Colombia, and having testified in front of the Brazilian Supreme Court that ruled that asbestos needed to be banned in Brazil. We still have a long ways to go in the world. And of course, as you might imagine, I'm working hard with colleagues here in the United States to try to get a proper ban here. A very simple question that somebody might ask is, does the stopping of the use of asbestos stop the development of disease? Very simply, the answer, of course, is yes. We know this from the data from countries where it has been stopped for a number of years. The first country in the world to ban asbestos, interestingly, was Iceland, followed quickly by Sweden and some of the other Scandinavian countries. In Sweden, where they stopped using it more than 30 years ago, there has been a significant drop in new cases of mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases. However, as we'll point out later, disease can occur many, many decades later. So even in the United States or Mexico, if we stopped using asbestos tomorrow, literally tomorrow, we would still have disease for 50 or 60 years onward because of past use. It has a very long, what we call latency period. As Guillermo already mentioned, in some parts of the world, data collection is poor, but we know that the absence of data does not mean the absence of disease. Russia, for example, no longer counts mesotheliomas as a separate disease, so they will tell you they have no mesotheliomas, even though they have the largest asbestos mine in the world. I've done a lot of work in India, and for many, many years, the Indian government agency there had no mesotheliomas recorded. But a number of years ago, I was speaking to a doctor there who, at his one cancer hospital in Mumbai, in the old city of Bombay, 1 year alone, they had 32 cases of mesothelioma, but none had ever been recorded by the official government agency. So one has to be very careful about interpreting the presence or absence of disease depending on these kinds of factors. Now, in the world of asbestos, there are still some legitimate scientific questions and controversies. For example, do the different fibers, all of which produce disease, do they have variable toxicity? There's data in many different ways. So I believe it's an unsettled issue, and it really doesn't matter because all the fiber types cause disease. What is the difference depending on fiber size? This is a hypothesis put forward by Dr. Merle Stanton many years ago, that certain fibers are more carcinogenic than others. But again, that's been put in a bad light because people claim that if their fibers are less than a certain size, they're not harmful, which is not true. There's also a question of fiber synergy. Some data exists. If you mix two types of fibers together, they have more carcinogenic effect than if you have a single fiber type that someone is exposed to. Contrived controversies exist in many ways. The so-called safety of chrysotile, I'll show you some data that really should have you understand that there is no such thing as a safe asbestos. The whole issue of biopersistence and all the fallacies around that. There's the concept of controlled use. Countries that continue to use it say, well, we control it, but in reality, that's not the case. A study was done in Canada a few years ago looking at 10 work sites, and they have very strict laws as to workplace exposures. And in 9 of the 10 situations with so-called controlled use, in reality, it didn't exist. And one of the things that I've run into in India, for example, is the asbestos industry there claims, well, Indians are different than Westerners, than Europeans or Americans. The genetics are different. Well, as one of our colleagues who's with us today, a medical anthropologist, knows, the genetic variability between humans, is extremely small. We share probably 99.999% of our genes, and there's obviously no such thing as a genetic makeup that protects you from getting asbestos-related disease, as they claim in India. So one has to be aware of all these kinds of arguments. The same Dr. Montague Murray, who did that autopsy in 1899, recognized that asbestos was a hazard. It was in the late 1890s that the British government put out the first major report on the hazards of asbestos. So he was aware of this, and he wrote, "One hears, generally speaking, that considerable trouble is now taken to prevent the inhalation of dust, and so the disease is not so likely to occur as heretofore." This was in 1906, when they were already talking about controlling dust and not having disease. But as we are together in 2022, we know that there's a whole spectrum of asbestos-related disease. There's non-malignant diseases, some that are not particularly important, like asbestos warts. There's benign asbestotic pleural effusions, where the asbestos irritates the pleura and causes a fluid buildup, but it's not cancer. And then, of course, asbestosis. And even though we call it a non-malignant disease because it's not cancer, in some working groups, up to 10% of people will die of asbestosis. One of the big problems, of course, with asbestos is that it causes many different kinds of cancer: lung cancer, pleural, peritoneal, and pericardial mesotheliomas. It causes a variety of gastrointestinal tract cancers of the esophagus, stomach, and colorectal areas. And the literature on that keeps growing and growing. And I've done some of these studies in places like China. laryngeal cancer, the voice box, the oropharynx, the throat area. Kidney cancer is also increased following exposure to asbestos. And in women, there's the problem of ovarian cancer. This is what an asbestos mine looks like. This is a picture from the formerly named town of Asbestos, Quebec. They've renamed the town with some benign sounding names, so it doesn't have its old history. The town in Russia where they mine asbestos is also called Asbest in Russia. So there's a close relationship between geography and the product that comes from there. Here's a much better looking asbestos body, and I will say that all of you that are on this seminar this evening, probably everybody in the world has some small amount of asbestos in their lungs. It's a ubiquitous product. It's naturally occurring. It's been used by the tens of millions of tons around the world. You can find it in the ice caps of the Arctic. And you can follow through the ice caps its continued and increasing use over the years. So we all have a few asbestos bodies, but clearly we don't all get or die from any kind of asbestos-related disease. This is lung tissue that's been scarred by exposure to asbestos. It should be very thin and lacy, but it gets thickened and it makes it harder for the oxygen to be transported from the air sacs into the bloodstream. That's what we're talking about when we discuss asbestosis and its ability to cause people's death. Radiologically, this is what it might look like. I'm not going to spend time on much radiology tonight. This is the lung and the pleura of a Canadian chrysotile miner. He had come to our hospital many years ago at Mount Sinai, where I was doing my training. I did both my medical school training and my hospital training and my occupational medicine training. And that white rind that you see around the lung, which is markedly compressed, that's not a cancer. You can have cancers that look like that. That is just a very thickened pleura that was caused by his exposures to chrysotile at the mine he was working at. While it was suggested that asbestos caused lung cancer as far back as the 1930s, and the first textbook to say that asbestos should be considered a cause of lung cancer was in 1942. The first epidemiology was done by Sir Richard Dahl, working out of the Radcliffe Infirmary at the University of Oxford, who in 1955 showed that he found at an asbestos factory 18 cases of lung cancer, 17% of the deaths. He expected 4% of the deaths from that population. So we now had our first epidemiological evidence of lung cancer being caused by asbestos. This is what a lung cancer might look like. It can occur anywhere in the lung, but it often occurs, or more often occurs, in the lower part of the lung, in contrast to the usual cigarette smoker's lung cancer, which tends to be more in the upper and middle part of the lung. This is a field of tobacco, for those of you that don't recognize this plant. And the reason I put this in there is because there's a special relationship between asbestos exposure and tobacco use. If you don't smoke and you don't work with asbestos, you have a very low risk of getting lung cancer. If you work with asbestos, and we'll take that low risk as 1, baseline. If you work with asbestos but don't smoke, your risk of getting lung cancer is increased 5 times. If you're an average 1-pack-a-day smoker but don't work with asbestos, you have about a 10 or 11-fold increased risk of getting a lung cancer. But as you see here, if you are both a smoker and you're exposed to asbestos, the risk isn't additive, it is multiplied. So you have a 50-fold increased risk in the possibility of getting lung cancer. This was first described in the late 1960s. This is data from about 10 years later. But this synergism, this multiplicative effect has been well known and documented in the scientific literature. And other multiple exposures have similar issues, radiation and smoking for lung cancer, or alcohol use, and benzene in terms of bone marrow problems. This is a typical X-ray of the disease most related in people's minds with asbestos. This is a mesothelioma. It's a cancer in 90% of the cases of the lining of the lung. About 10% are in the abdomen, about 1% around the heart, and in males, less than 1% in the testicular area. You can also get benign changes in the pleura. This is a calcified plaque on the diaphragm. And just to put in perspective how uncommon mesotheliomas had been, one of my teachers at Mount Sinai, and I was there from the late 60s onward, but Dr. Rabin in 1931 had reported on a new case of mesothelioma, and he found 3 others in his search of the medical literature. One of the local pathologists at Mount Sinai didn't even think that mesothelioma was a separate disease. So for the next 30 years, the 2 of them were looking for new cases of mesothelioma. This was a hospital with 100,000 admissions every year. So every 10 years, there would be 1 million patients. And in the 3 decades after this, in each decade, they found 1 case of mesothelioma. So the baseline rate before the modern explosion in the use of asbestos was probably about 1 in 1 million. We have parts of the world now where we have 10 and 12 per million. The rate in England is even higher than that. Parts of Australia have enormous high rates from when they mined asbestos. So we have some baseline data. And the relationship between mesothelioma and asbestos, which had been suggested as far back as the 1930s, came again to fruition when Dr. Wagner in South Africa in 1960 reported that there were 33 cases of mesothelioma, all from one small area of South Africa where there was an asbestos mine. And he saw those 33 cases in just 4 years. So from 1 in 1 million to 33 in 4 years in one small area was certainly convincing evidence that asbestos could cause mesothelioma. So the question is, what about the different fiber types? Can they all cause disease? When Dr. Wagner left South Africa and went to Great Britain, he went to work at the pneumoconiosis research center in Wales, and he started having rats inhale asbestos. And as you see here, he got Canadian chrysotile, caused as many lung cancers as chrysotile or anthophyllite or amosite, Rhodesian chrysotile even more. These are the chrysotiles versus the amphiboles. But look here, in the mesotheliomas, chrysotile, which some people try to claim is the most harmful, gave no more mesotheliomas than chrysotile. And chrysotile miners get mesotheliomas, and that's been shown in all those countries where chrysotile has been mined: Canada, Brazil, India, and elsewhere. The other very logical question is, how much exposure does it take? And unfortunately, we've learned from the same studies of Dr. Wagner and some human studies that it takes very little exposure. Here we see that as little as 1 day of exposure gave 2 animals lung cancers, 2 animals mesothelioma. And as you had longer exposures, you got more disease, the classic sort of dose-response relationship, the same thing with mesotheliomas. The control animals with no asbestos, neither of these diseases were present. So very little exposure. And we have human cases as little as 1 day. Those have been reported from the United States, from Great Britain, from Australia, that 1 day of exposure has been sufficient. It's not very common, but it tells you how powerful asbestos is as a carcinogenic agent. This is data from Dr. Solikoff, my teacher, from a factory that we studied when I was still with him back at Mount Sinai. And we see here that working 1 month or less at an asbestos factory doubled your risk of lung cancer. And by the time you worked there for 2 years, you had more than a 7-fold increased risk of developing lung cancer. So in humans, again, it doesn't take very much to produce lung cancer either. Another logical question is, when does the disease occur? You know, it's just like cigarette smoking. You start smoking maybe in your teens, but you don't get your lung cancers till you're 50 or 60 or 70. You start seeing a few cases of disease as early as 10 years, but the peak for asbestos-related disease, as I pointed out earlier, is many decades later. This is the peak for lung cancer. It's out at about 40 years. Mesotheliomas are out at about 45 years, 40 and 45 years. And deaths from asbestosis similarly occur many, many decades later. So again, if we stopped asbestos use tomorrow, we'd have a long tail of these diseases showing up for many decades to come. I will have to tell you that as much as I tried studying this 40 years ago and others are still studying it, we still don't know exactly how asbestos causes cancer, but we know that it does cause it, and that's quite clear. So where do people generally get exposed to asbestos? And now we're going to leave sort of the basic biology and talk about exposures. So significant occupational exposures are mining and milling of asbestos, making products out of asbestos, insulation work, construction work, shipbuilding and ship repair, maintenance of all kinds. Power production facilities use a lot of asbestos. Railroads traditionally have had a lot of asbestos exposure. But we also know that there are things like household contacts, consumer products, and neighborhood contamination, waste disposal after demolition, and sprayed surfaces in public buildings. Here's a typical asbestos insulator. He's putting asbestos cement on a pipe. Not surprisingly, he and other members of his labor union will develop asbestos-related disease from handling on an ongoing and regular basis large amounts of asbestos. But they also used asbestos in other ways. Asbestos was first introduced in Great Britain as a spray-on material, which came to the United States in 1935. And by 1970, more than half of all multi-story buildings were being fireproofed by the spraying on of asbestos-containing materials. Some of you may recognize this. This is one of the towers of the World Trade Center. This is the other tower on the left as it was being constructed. It was the last big building that had spraying of asbestos because while these buildings were under construction, a ban was put into place that no longer allowed the spraying of asbestos in the United States. And what do we mean by spraying? Here's an asbestos insulator spraying asbestos on a steel beam. And as you see, some of it even stayed on the beam. But what happened to the rest of it? This is what the laborer would have to come by and sweep up. This is what the electrician would be exposed to. This is what the brick mason was exposed to. So what we basically learned is that construction sites, even if you didn't work with asbestos, if it was not part of your job duties, you were still very much exposed. Here again is an asbestos insulator dropping asbestos cement out. He's not wearing a proper respirator. This dust mask that he has on isn't going to protect him very much. But back here, we have a gentleman from another trade. He could be what? An electrician, a carpenter, a plumber, different trades. And he's what we call a bystander. So there's direct exposure and there's bystander exposure. So again, anybody in the construction trades when asbestos was widely used would have been at risk of developing disease. Shipyards were another area with considerable use of asbestos. Here's the hold of a ship and all this gray material, these blocks here, the covering over the metal. This is all asbestos. And Peter Harries in Great Britain showed that in one dockyard, one shipyard, in a 10-year period, there were 156 cases of disabling asbestosis, not just ordinary, asbestosis, but ones that disabled the worker. Only about a third of them were in the sprayers and laggers who directly handled it. And of the 55 mesotheliomas, and again, this is in one shipyard in 10 years, only 2 of them were in direct handling trades, and all of these other crafts were had people in them that developed mesotheliomas. This is something that we see ubiquitously around the world. It's auto mechanics blowing out dust from brakes. This gentleman is having air monitoring on his chest. If I get my data right, I know that Mexico still makes asbestos-containing brakes. So the manufacturing of those brakes puts people at risk, and then after they're sold, it puts end users at risk because of this kind of activity. And I won't tell you that every one of these fibers is an asbestos fiber, but we know that there are plenty of asbestos fibers in the dust that comes out from brakes. So now we've talked about occupational exposure, but it goes beyond that. It goes out into the community, into consumer products, and into the general environment. This is an X-ray that you may sort of recognize. It looks like the one I showed you earlier. It's a young man with a mesothelioma. He was 28 years old and he presented with pain in his pleura. The doctors, and a young man, wasn't sure what was going on. So a few months later, they took tissue out of him. They found that he had developed a pleural mesothelioma. They found asbestos fibers in his lung. And just before his 30th birthday, he died of his mesothelioma. So you might say, well, how would a 30-year-old develop a mesothelioma? Especially because he didn't ever work with asbestos. He was trained at university in accounting and was a bookkeeper. But when history was taken, he was born on one street and then lived on another street in Brooklyn, part of New York City. Here, these 2 white dots show Ross Street and Wilson Street. And we have the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard here. And as I said, shipyards used a lot of asbestos. It would drift out into the neighborhood. And so he had his 30 years of exposure from the time he was a baby brought home from the hospital. Not only do we see it there, but we see similar kinds of changes elsewhere around the world. This is studies from London. This is the work of Dr. Newhouse, the same hospital that Montague Murray worked at. In one hospital, she had 76 cases of mesothelioma. About half the workers, or half was in workers. But we see here that 9 of the cases were in people who lived with a worker. So we call this household or family exposure. And 11 cases were people who lived within half a mile of the same asbestos textile factory in London. Now, when it says no known exposure, these cases go back to 1910, and nobody was asking about it, exposure to asbestos, so the hospital records didn't reflect it as they should now, so that one can see there are many settings in which you can get disease. This is a study from the Finns, from Finland. They've closed their asbestos mine too. They've banned it. In County A, where they had a mine, 6,300 x-rays of the general population, and about 500 of them had evidence of calcification, a sign of exposure to asbestos. In another county with no mine, similar number of x-rays, even a bit more, 7,100, not a single case of calcification. So general environmental exposure, living near a mine, is sufficient to give somebody disease, or living near a factory. This is Washington, D.C., our nation's capital here in the United States, and just north of it, here's actually Bethesda, which is where the National Cancer Institute is, where I studied, and just above there would have been a place called Rockville, Maryland. And it was called Rockville because they mined this rock. The veins in this rock were asbestos, not enough to make it commercially important, but made it very crushable so that you could crush it and use it on playgrounds and parking lots and secondary roads. Not so bad maybe to be in the first vehicle, but I'm not sure I would want to be in this vehicle with asbestos dust kicking up. All kinds of products, at least 3, 4, maybe even 5,000 products in America contained asbestos. This was a roofing material. This was material sold to have public school children or school children in many settings work with what was called the asbestos head to make materials out of asbestos waste products. This was used to decorate people's Christmas trees. Instead of other things, they would throw white asbestos over the tree to keep it, as it says here, fireproof. And one cigarette company was foolish enough for a period of time to put asbestos filter tips on their cigarettes. So think of that. You could get a puff of your carcinogen with every puff of your carcinogen. Now, I'm a physician. I've prescribed medicines for people over the years. Until it was banned, our pharmaceutical industry used to use asbestos filters to filter drugs. And if you looked at the bottom of some of these vials, you could actually find asbestos fibers in there that we would have been injecting either intravenously, intramuscularly, whatever, into our patients. We were giving them asbestos through the drugs we had ordered to treat their conditions. This is a picture at Mount Sinai where I trained, where they took down an old apartment building across from the hospital, which is in the background. They just knocked it down. They didn't bother to take any asbestos out, creating a hazard for anybody in the area. And even inside the hospital building, this was asbestos material coming off steam pipes. And they decided finally to get rid of it. They pulled it out. They put it on the back of a truck. They didn't cover the truck. Goes down to this end of the block. This is in the middle of New York City. This is what we call Central Park, a big open air park in the middle of Manhattan. You have to make a left turn here. It's a one-way street, and the truck would be driving down Fifth Avenue, a famous street in New York City, with asbestos blowing out, contaminating every place that it went. And because the truck wasn't very big, they couldn't put all the asbestos on it in one trip. So they ended up storing it under the main air intake for the hospital. Even though we were doing world-class research on asbestos, the people in charge of the buildings and maintenance people didn't appreciate the hazards as we knew them. I moved on to other places. This is for my next university. I was at the University of Kentucky for a number of years. This again is a pipe that needed repair and replacing. Bicycles would be tied up with asbestos wrap around pipes. This is probably an ironing board cover that had asbestos in it. But now when the asbestos was taken out, the workers would come dressed in appropriate safety gear. They would have proper respirators. They would use HEPA filters to vacuum out fibers. They would wear appropriate respirators. They would use water to keep the dust down and then filter out the asbestos fibers from the water, because we know that if you just wet it down and let the water run off downstream, it becomes somebody else's drinking water. And then you do air measurements to see that you're disturbing the asbestos didn't make it worse than what you started with. I'll finish up with some of my international thoughts. It says here, we're in a one world marketplace now, Globot. We have to produce to the same high standards right around the globe. What about health and safety standards? That depends on which part of the world you work in. So as you've heard me say, I've worked in China, I've worked in India, I've worked in Mongolia, I've done work in South America. Here's the factories in China where they make brakes. Women wear cotton gauze masks, not appropriate to keep the fibers out as they release them from working on them. As I said, brakes are something still made in Mexico. This was the textile part of the factory. In the world of public health, legal action can bring about change. So if we have any people that are interested in bringing legal action, I do a lot of medical legal work here in the United States. I testify on behalf of injured workers. The monies all go to my university, not to me. So legal action will bring about change. We know that there was significant prevention literature by 1930. And I'll end with this picture. This is the same World Trade Center that we saw going up. And now after 9/11, just a few days ago, we celebrated the 21st anniversary. It came down. We had steel beams that still had asbestos on them that we would then recycle by selling them to India and to China, letting the people there rip off the old asbestos. And the dust in lower Manhattan contained up to 4% asbestos. And we're now starting to see, 21 years later, some new cases of mesothelioma from people that were exposed. So the legacies of the past is that even if we stopped use, we'd have disease and death into the future. There's still continued wide use in the world. Engineering controls are not well developed. We need to have regulations put aside and the total ban put in place. Legal issues are important. And just in the United States, we have 25 million tons of asbestos in place. And so diseases like asbestos diseases and all the pneumoconioses are best treated, if you will, by prevention, because you can't really take care of people after they get sick. So with that, let me stop sharing, and we'll see about taking some questions if that's appropriate. So thank you for hearing me out today.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Frank. Excelente presentación. Me llama poderosamente la atención esta diapositiva donde equiparas en los estudios del doctor Wagner la incidencia de mesotelioma en ratas, indiferente del tipo de asbesto que utilicemos, sea crocidolita o sea crisotilo. Y quiero llamar la atención sobre esto y de pronto usted, doctor Frank, nos puede aclarar un poco más, porque posteriormente encontramos otras posiciones del mismo doctor Wagner, cuando empezó a desarrollar algunas posiciones en donde decía que el crisotilo no era responsable de las enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto, o si lo era, era en muy menor grado frente a los anfíboles. ¿Tú qué nos puedes decir de eso, doctor Frank?
It's a very simple but sad story. Dr. Wagner was approached by the asbestos industry. That's a whole discussion for another time. I often talk about what I call science for sale. There are scientists that will basically sell their opinions. And he ended up, there was testimony in a legal case here in the United States that he was being sent money every month into an American bank account in a sort of a fake name that was actually his bank account. And that it was a large sum of money every month, and that all he had to do for this was basically to protect the chrysotile industry, because that was the major user. That was what was coming out of Canada, that was coming out of Russia. It was the material that most often went into asbestos cement products. And so unfortunately, he and there are still scientists like him around that become apologists for the asbestos industry, setting aside the science as it exists, and in Dr. Wagner's case, literally setting aside his own excellent research. So that, unfortunately, is the quick and dirty story of why Dr. Wagner put forth some of his ideas.
Ok, doctor, muchísimas gracias. Deseo la palabra a Renata, quien va a coordinar la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Adelante, Renata.
Muchas gracias, doctor Frank, por su exposición. Ha sido muy interesante toda la información que nos ha proporcionado. Tenemos una pregunta. In a more integrated perspective for many of the people who were highly exposed to asbestos, there is a great hope that biomarkers, mesothelin and carretenin, DLD, can be a way to access early detection, not only for them and their families, but for populations or countries with limited health resources, as Mexico. In your opinion about the predictive efficacy of these biomarkers and their possibilities so that they can be an alternative for early detection in Latin America in the short or medium term, what can you say about?
Well, I wish I had a better opinion of biomarkers. As we sit here today, there have been over the decades several biomarkers that people have looked at. None of them have been proven to be especially helpful in finding disease. These are changes that once the disease exists, the levels of some of these materials will increase, but the disease is already there. I know of no biomarker to date that has been predictive. The closest we got to that, if you will, because even if you find a biomarker, at least let's talk about mesotheliomas. If you have a biomarker for mesothelioma, it may well be that there has to be enough tissue there to produce enough material to have a positive biomarker test. And at least so far, mesothelioma is essentially a death certificate kind of disease, because I don't know, I've never seen a cured mesothelioma. Many, many years ago, I mean, I'm talking 30, maybe 40 years ago, somebody decided, well, maybe we could find lung cancers early. And what they did was they put saline down in people's lungs and sucked the saline back out, and they found that there might be some cancer cells in there. The problem was they couldn't tell where the cancer was. It was so small, and they found these few cells that even though they knew that there was potentially a cancer growing in there, they couldn't tell where it was. Now, maybe these days you could find, other kinds of markers, or you could find radioactive materials that could seek out these cells. But there has never been a really good history of biomarkers being predictive of disease. If we look at other tissues, if we look at colonic cancer, people wanted to use something called CEA, chorioembryonic antigen. It goes up, but that's only after you have the disease. We try to use something called PSA, prostate-specific antigen. And older men like myself regularly get PSA testing. But first of all, you can have a cancer without the PSA going up. And by the time the PSA goes up, the cancer is pretty far along. So there is not a good history in general of biomarkers being certainly predictive of disease. Now, it is useful in other ways. The CEA, for example, if somebody has a colon cancer, you do the surgery, you take out the colon section with the cancer, the CEA comes down because the cancer is no longer there. And then you can monitor that person. And if the CEA starts going up again, you worry about metastatic disease. But I don't know of a single biomarker in the field of cancer that has really been predictive or that in any way has changed the outcome of disease because it has been looked at. And, you're talking about looking at populations, there's an old expression I learned from my teacher, Dr. Selikoff, when he was asked, why did he study insulators, which had a very high rate of disease and a very high rate of exposure. He invoked what he called the Willie Sutton rule. Willie Sutton in the 1930s was an American bank robber. He would go around the country literally robbing banks. And they said to him, well, why do you rob banks? And he says, that's where the money is. And Selikoff said, the reason I studied insulators, they had the most exposure. So I wanted to see if there was disease with a lot of exposure. But we've learned that even lesser and lesser and lesser exposures carry a much lower risk of disease. You still get it. So that looking at family members, you'd need so many of them to maybe even find, one or another, because mesotheliomas are still very rare diseases. I mean, in America, with 330 million people, we have about 3,500 cases. They're devastating. They're death sentences. And we can be predictive of who's going to get them depending on their history of exposure, but not on their biomarkers. So that's my sense of that.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Frank.
Gracias.
Veo que el chat hoy está bastante...
Yo tengo una pregunta.
En cuanto a preguntas, antes de hacerte la palabra, Renata, quería preguntarle al doctor Frank, tú has tenido la oportunidad de trabajar, y eso es algo que me llama poderosamente la atención, que no te has limitado a trabajar en países desarrollados, que has tenido la oportunidad de salir de Estados Unidos y trabajar en países como India, trabajar en países como Sri Lanka, trabajar en países como China, trabajar en Colombia, trabajar en Brasil. ¿Cuál es tu experiencia? ¿Qué sientes? ¿Qué es la diferencia? Aquello que nos impide acceder a una mejor ruta diagnóstica en el tema de las enfermedades relacionadas con el asbesto. Si existe algún patrón o algunas indicaciones que tú nos puedas dar sobre las limitaciones que tú fácilmente identificas en países por fuera de los Estados Unidos o de Europa, en donde cuentan con tecnologías y equipo humano más desarrollado.
Well, there's two ways to look at that. Yes, we have maybe some better trained people in some ways in countries like the United States or the countries of Western Europe or Scandinavia, but I will still tell you that for the average physician anywhere, the biggest problem, be it a developed country, developing country, anywhere, nobody really asks a very basic question. This is a question that goes back to the year 1700. You mentioned the Collegium Ramazzini earlier. Bernardino Ramazzini is the father of occupational medicine. And what he said was, it is incumbent upon physicians to ask the common man what he does for a living. And the corollary to that is, well, what do you do and what exposures, what materials do you work with? And I will tell you, 45 years ago, I supervised, when I was a young faculty member, 2 students who read 400 medical charts, and only about 2% of them had anything resembling a decent exposure history. So we don't even have doctors anywhere, this was in the United States, asking about prior exposures, because then you would start monitoring people. Not that you could necessarily prevent the disease, but you could find it in an earlier stage. So it's not unique to developing countries. It's the same problem in America and Europe. Europe is actually a bit better. They train doctors more in occupational medicine than we do in the United States. What I thought you might be asking is the other problem, of course, where we do have some advantage in the more developed countries, is in areas of radiology and pathology. Our radiologists are more attuned to looking for dust-related diseases, asbestosis, silicosis, coal-workers, pneumoconiosis, and so forth. They get trained to do that. Because you and I did our workshop a few years ago, we know that in Colombia, let's say, doctors don't get very much training in being able to recognize dust diseases. These other countries that I've worked in, Mongolia is another one, we have the same problem. The other thing is that the pathologists are better able to recognize what is often a very difficult diagnosis and making it under the microscope, mesotheliomas. In a lot of countries, mesotheliomas are misdiagnosed as lung cancers. Now, that's still a problem, but you would treat them very differently. So The issue is to better train the general practicing doctor to ask about exposures, and then to train the specialists to think about diseases that they haven't much thought about or been trained to look for in the past.
Muchas gracias, doctor Fran. Renata, por favor, continúa.
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta. Es muy, no sé cómo decirlo, preocupante tal vez, que a pesar de toda la evidencia científica que hay desde los años 30, bueno, tú nos has hablado de, incluso desde finales del siglo XIX ya había los médicos ya tenían una asociación entre el asbesto y ciertas enfermedades, ¿no? Entonces, me llama la atención que a pesar de toda esta evidencia que se ha acumulado a lo largo de este siglo, en Estados Unidos no se ha prohibido totalmente. ¿A qué crees que responde? ¿Nos puedes contar un poco más acerca de la situación en Estados Unidos? Siendo un país de altos
absolutely.
ingresos.
And we're working right now to try to get the Congress, there's a bill called the R-Ban bill, Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Act. I knew Alan Reinstein. I work with his widow, Linda Reinstein, who's started ADAO, the Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization. The reason we haven't banned asbestos in the United States is because the companies fought back for two reasons. One, they fought to continue to sell a product that was dangerous. Think of the tobacco industry. They sell a dangerous product. Think of the lead industry that sold us leaded gasoline for many, many decades till we finally got smart enough to take the lead out of gasoline. So we have, I hate to say it, it's a moral issue and an economic issue, and it's companies that are just simply greedy. In the United States, we have a second problem, which is our legal system. Most countries, if you get a work-related disease, your only recourse really is a workers' compensation system, which again, the industries have worked very hard to make it hard for someone to receive compensation. So again, the British did this back in the 1930s. They were having asbestos disease in their factories. What they would do is they would go to the widow, hand her a £5 note, which might have been worth $25 or $30, which was a lot of money then, and say, don't sue us. Or the other one they did is we'll come every year and give you a £1 note, $5, just don't sue us. So they kept things out of the workers' compensation system. In the United States, we have what's called third-party litigation. So I'm a worker. I work in a garage, in a service station. I repair automobiles. And I work with asbestos brakes and asbestos clutches. If I get a mesothelioma, I can't sue the owner of the gasoline station. Or if I do, I can only get workers' compensation, which is pretty minimal. But in America, we have a system where I can sue the people who supplied the brakes and the clutches to the garage. And that's where the millions and millions of dollars change hands in our litigation system. So if you're a company, you're going to fight very hard to see that you create doubt science. This is part of science for sale. The tobacco industry knew that cigarettes cause cancer. They didn't come out and say cigarettes didn't do it. They just said, we're not sure. The asbestos companies, we're not sure. These are controversies. It's not chrysotile. It's something else. It's lung cancer. It was smoking. And in fact, in 1989, a lot of years ago, the Environmental Protection Agency banned the use of asbestos, but the industry took it to court. They found the most favorable court. They do that. They call it venue shopping. They go to the places where they get the most conservative judges, and the court threw out the ban. We're now trying to get a ban put back in place 30 years later. But it's all about money. And even though these companies no longer use asbestos, they're still having to pay out literally millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the most recent classical example of that is the Johnson & Johnson talcum powder issue. Talc is very closely related to asbestos. Baby powder has been contaminated with asbestos. What Johnson & Johnson did is, after they had 30,000 lawsuits, they stopped selling it in the United States and Canada. I wrote a letter to the editor of our local paper saying, so you're stopping selling it in the United States and Canada, but it's still okay to kill people in another 160 countries around the world. They didn't like me for that. They came after me. They finally recently said they're going to stop selling it. They're going to go to cornstarch, which is a lot safer, of course. But they also pulled a maneuver in the courts. This is a company worth about $420 billion, and they carved out $2 billion to satisfy 30,000 lawsuits. So it's all about money. It's all about greed. It's all about paying scientists and for-profit research companies to confuse the issue and to get in the way of a ban.
Gracias, doctor. Muy clara la explicación.
Yeah.
Tenemos otra pregunta. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. No, okay. ¿Qué nos puede decir en su experiencia sobre la reacción de la población en diferentes países frente a los riesgos del asbesto en tantos productos que usamos en nuestra vida cotidiana, donde el riesgo del asbesto es ocultado? ¿Cuál sería para usted una estrategia adecuada para sensibilizar sobre esos productos?
Education. I mean, that's the simple answer. The Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization is about educating people, putting information out so people know what products contain it. You know, asbestos cement, water pipes, brake products, automotive products, other things that are made and I'm sure used in Mexico. The countries where there has been success in banning asbestos, you know, all of the European Union did it, and the Scandinavian countries and others did it because the science is compelling and they don't have the same strength of industry. Canada took a lot longer because they were still mining asbestos. Russia, you know, has gone the other way. They don't even count mesotheliomas anymore. What we found in Colombia when we met with the legislators, and Guillermo can speak to this, they were very clear that they wanted to stop mining it, and they were going to, they were going to stop making products out of it. They were going to not use asbestos, but for a while they still wanted to mine it and sell it to other people. So when I met with the legislators, I pointed out, is this something you really want to do? You may be protecting Colombians, but if you're going to sell your asbestos to other people, aren't you just causing death and disease in other countries? And do you really want to do that? And they changed the bill, you know, towards the end and took out even allowing the mines to continue to operate. I think what's been successful is two kinds of groups that have pushed to get asbestos banned, and that's probably what you're going to need to do in Mexico. You're going to need to get labor unions that are involved to speak up. In Brazil, 15,000 workers who were employed by the asbestos industry spoke against the ban, but 300,000 workers who used their products spoke in favor of the ban. So just the numbers there, 300,000 is a lot more voters than the 15,000. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, in many countries, what is very successful, like ADAO in America and elsewhere, are NGOs. You get citizens involved, a grassroots kind of thing, and you almost have to shame people into this. I'll just share with you a very quick story. I was just over in India about 2 weeks ago. I've been there 30 times in my career. I was just over there, and I spent one whole day with a group of very senior leaders, somebody who was head of the Economics Institute in New Delhi, somebody from the Mining Institute, a lawyer, a architect who had learned about the hazards of asbestos, a physician, other civic leaders, and we had a whole workshop. I gave a talk similar to this to them, and they're now planning a grassroots movement to get the government there to consider giving up asbestos. The big problem there, do you know who owns a lot of the asbestos cement factories? Members of Parliament. And not only have they not banned asbestos, but they've put tariffs on safer materials at a very high level, and the tariff on importing asbestos is very low. So the cheapest thing to use is asbestos. So it's going to be difficult, but these are some very, I would say, to use a colloquial expression, heavy hitters. These are very important people that have had senior government positions who know how to get to the politicians. Citizens and activists and unions that are affected are your hope for mobilizing interest in banning asbestos. We do that here. When I have hearings with congressional staff people, which I do from time to time, we bring in the firefighters union, we bring in educational groups. We talk about where you'll find asbestos in homes. I gave a talk recently to the EPA staff that worries about asbestos in public schools and showed them all the places asbestos could be found in schools. So it's just education to start with.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Muy interesante. Sí, Guillermo.
Doctor Frank, en el actual proceso que se está adelantando en Estados Unidos para prohibir el asbesto, esos dos grupos que tú mencionaste, los sindicatos y la sociedad civil, ¿están participando activamente en ese proceso o hay otros grupos de la sociedad civil que estén envueltos empujando la prohibición en Estados Unidos?
Like with everything else, some unions are more aggressive. The firefighters have a big presence, and we know that mesotheliomas are elevated in firefighters because they go into buildings and they rip things apart and they're exposed to the asbestos in buildings. So they're very active. The problem is labor unions in the United States, up until very recently, when we had a president who supports the idea of labor unions, have become very weak. So the traditional unions, the construction unions, the insulators, plumbers, pipe fitters, and so forth, first of all, they don't have as much exposure because they see it as an old problem because products are no longer made with asbestos to a large extent. We still do use it. It's still a legal product. The biggest issue here in the United States is not so much its continuing use. We only import a few thousand tons a year compared to 800,000 back in the 1970s. So the use is down. The problem is all the stuff that's already in place. And so the unions, which are basically fighting for their basic lives and existence, health and safety takes second place after simple economic issues, which is what they're fighting for right now. But there's hardly a group that I haven't seen, and I've got to tell you, there's hardly a product out there that has asbestos that I haven't been involved with. A little quick story. A couple of years ago, I get a call from an attorney. You know, among these, I do about 500 legal cases a year for asbestos disease. And an attorney called me up and he said, "Oh, I have a case that I bet you've never seen. It's a man who drilled bowling balls, you know, big bowling balls. When you put the finger holes in it, you have to drill it. And this was a man who professionally sold bowling balls and would drill them for professional bowlers. And he got a mesothelioma because there's asbestos in bowling balls." And I said, "You know, you're right. That's pretty unusual, except that's the second case I've had. And about a month later, I had my third case. And recently I had my fourth case that involved bowling balls." So again, I've seen the chat pop up a little bit, and it says education. I assure you, the man drilling bowling balls didn't ever get told that there was asbestos in there. So we've got to get it out of products, stop using it, and then for all the millions and millions of tons in place, take it out and dispose of it safely.
Sí, sí, totalmente cierto. Tenemos otra pregunta. ¿Qué nos puede comentar sobre los materiales que sustituyen al asbesto? ¿Qué grado de seguridad o certificación tienen?
Well, first of all, if you look around the world, look at, let's say, Sweden, where they make automobiles, they make fighter jets, they build ships. They all are out there working perfectly well without any asbestos in them. So there are clearly good substitutes that nobody's shown that there's a problem. Let's go to the most common use of asbestos today, which is building materials. Okay, first of all, there are many substitutes for asbestos cement building materials: brick, tile, other things, metal roofs, whatever. But in some countries, I think it was Vietnam, what they found is that they could go into the forest, cut down weeds, plants, which after all, plants have fibers. There's nothing special in asbestos cement, which is the most common use these days around the world. There's nothing special about asbestos. It's the nature of the fiber that allows the cement to hold together. You can use less of the other materials, so it's lighter, it's cheaper if you put fibers in there. And they found that if they use plant fibers, it worked just as well. There was a situation here in the United States where there was a spray material for asbestos that was for noise control, not for fireproofing. It would be sprayed in school buildings for children to cut down on the noise. And what they found is that they took old newspapers and shredded them and used the fibers of old newsprint. They could spray this noise reducing material on the wall, and there was never any asbestos in it. So there are plenty of substitutes. The 70 countries that have banned it, they're not having a rash of fires or their cars not stopping. Everything still works like it should.
Sí, de hecho, lo que hemos observado en México es que la comercialización de productos con asbesto se ha reducido bastante durante las últimas décadas. Sin embargo, el gran problema es todo el asbesto que está instalado, todo el asbesto que ahora se está deteriorando y pues que está en el ambiente, ¿no? Porque pues ahora estos edificios tienen muchos años, son muy viejos y pues nadie está haciendo nada para retirarlos, removerlos y mucho menos hacerlo de forma segura.
And we're not doing much about it here in the United States. We do have a regulation. If you renovate an old building, if there is more than 160 square feet, which is not very much in a big building, you have to remove the asbestos and you have to remove it safely. If you want to take down and knock down an old building, you have to take the asbestos out first. The problem is, of course, that again, greed comes into being. And I've actually, among my legal activities, have been involved with, I think, 6 criminal cases for our Environmental Protection Agency, where I've been involved where people have forced workers to take asbestos out under unsafe conditions. And then these people end up paying fines and going to jail. I mean, one man went to jail for 7 years because he was having workers rip out the asbestos. And I educated the judge about that. And so he gave him a very, very big sentence.
Doctor Fran, el año pasado tuve la oportunidad de observar que la IAR hizo un nuevo pronunciamiento sobre asbesto en el agua. No sé si tú la conoces. Y más allá de eso, quisiera preguntarte tú qué sabes de el asbesto en el agua, la ingestión de asbesto a través del agua potable, y si tú has conocido casos legales en Estados Unidos de personas afectadas por asbesto en el agua potable.
Okay. The simple answer to the second part of the question is no, I've never heard of a case of ingesting asbestos through drinking water that has ended up in a court case. Now, that's not true for the pipes that were made out of asbestos cement. I've had any number of cases of workers who either put in the original pipes or repaired the pipes or took the old pipes out and crushed them. They will get disease if not properly protected. So, but that again is by inhalation. What your question also goes to, and that takes a little bit more of an answer. There is no question in my mind that the ingestion of asbestos fibers in water puts you at risk for stomach cancer, small bowel cancer, esophageal cancer, and colorectal cancer. And there is a growing body of literature that and kidney cancer. And the ingestion of asbestos clearly now has been shown, not just the inhalation, but the ingestion. But anytime you inhale it, you also ingest it. So we have no cases that come from drinking water. But whatever the source, the ingestion of asbestos can end up causing disease. There is a study from Norway among lighthouse keepers, people who are out on these isolated islands. They collect rainwater. They don't have any piped water. They collect rainwater in asbestos cement tanks. And the lighthouse keepers have gotten an excess of GI tract cancer drinking that water. So there is data about this. The United States is the only country in the world that I'm aware of that has a standard for asbestos in drinking water. It's 7 million fibers per liter of water. And interestingly that you bring this up, I have been getting many, many inquiries from Canada, from Great Britain, particularly in the last year and a half or so, of people being concerned about asbestos cement water pipes and what that might mean for a community. We know that if you, I've done animal studies, you put asbestos into the stomach of animals, they will get GI tract cancer in excess. I mean, we know it happens. So it doesn't matter if you inhale it and it ends up in your GI tract or if it comes in through water, it's the same thing. So I'm concerned about that. And I deal a lot with this issue of asbestos cement water pipe that I'm being asked about. And in some countries, I'm sure in places like Colombia, maybe in Mexico, rainwater will be collected off the roofs where it'll wash fibers into the whatever collection device is for the water, and there'll be fibers in there. So I think that's something else to be potentially concerned about.
¿Alguna pregunta más, Renata? Sí, hay una pregunta.
Sí. Dice, el porcentaje de mortalidad aumenta de forma elevada cuando la persona expuesta es fumadora. ¿Cómo argumentar a los legisladores o en un proceso judicial que el verdadero problema es el asbesto y no el tabaco?
Oh, well, first of all, tobacco is causing lung cancer, but you can smoke all you want. You'll never get a mesothelioma, except if you smoke those cigarettes that had asbestos filters. And I've had those cases, people who made the filters out of asbestos and who smoked those cigarettes. But leaving that aside, you never go to court and argue that it was the asbestos and not the smoking. You go to court and you honestly say it was the asbestos and the cigarettes, and it was together. And I had a case, it was a man who worked on a railroad, developed lung cancer. And what exposures did he have? He was a cigarette smoker. He had diesel exhaust. He had radiation because one of his regular runs was in and out of a plant that had a lot of radioactive material, and the area near the tracks was elevated in terms of its radiation exposures, and he had asbestos from the trains. So in that case, I argued he had 4 different sources, and one of them was his asbestos. I have been doing medical legal work for over 40 years, and the only reason I can still do it is because I give honest answers. I don't make things up. If I don't know something, I say I don't know it. And I'm always honest about what the science says. And I cite the data and the citations that back up what I believe in. And, you know, to some extent, I have over 100 papers of my own that have looked at asbestos-related issues that have been in the scientific literature. So maybe, you know, I can finish on this note. We have all these forces arrayed against us. We have the industry, we have politicians, we have dishonest scientists, but we have something they don't have, and that's the truth. And I have to believe that at the end of the day, however long it takes, the truth will win out at the end.
Maravillosa respuesta. Bueno, ya nos estamos acercando al final, no hay muchas preguntas en el chat. Quisiera aprovechar esta oportunidad, doctor Fran, de tenerte entre nosotros. ¿Qué nos puedes contar tú de la experiencia de haber trabajado con el doctor Irving J. Selikov? Estamos en un escenario de amigos que están tratando de luchar por prohibir el asbesto en México. Y estoy seguro que el legado de Selikov para cualquiera que intente busque este objetivo es muy importante. ¿Cuál consideras tú que fueron los aspectos claves que logró manejar Selikov cuando trató de divulgar el mensaje de la necesidad de que Estados Unidos avanzara hacia la prohibición del asbesto, a introducir medidas regulatorias en las leyes para prevenir los trabajadores, etcétera? El extraordinario trabajo que él hizo, ¿cuáles son los aspectos importantes del éxito que él tuvo?
There's 2, and it's very simple. First of all, be a credible scientist. So do work that gives you credibility as a scientist, that you've studied this issue. Okay. It's not like the climate change issue that we see where all of these, 97% of the world's scientists and all the climate scientists say climate change is real, and 3% of scientists say that it isn't real, but they never studied this issue. They just, I read the literature and I don't believe it kind of guys. So he did the work. I mean, I'd like to think, and I followed him. I've done my share of work in other areas as well. So you have to be credible as a scientist. That's the first thing, that people can believe you understand the topic. And I learned that from him. And the other thing, the other piece of it, is I've already mentioned, is education. He was a master educator. He educated students. He educated other doctors. He educated politicians. I remember meeting, senators, United States senators in his office when he would be educating them about asbestos. He educated the unions because a lot of them didn't know about the problem. So it's education and having credibility as a scientist. Those are the two things that he brought.
And I think he educated as well to the media, no?
Oh, and he was very good in dealing with the media, and I learned that from him too. And I mean, tomorrow, for example, I have a lady calling me. I got an email from her yesterday. She said, "You were very helpful a year ago," and she wrote up a very nice article in a trade journal about the hazards of asbestos. And she says, "I have some new questions about the same thing you were asking about the ingestion of asbestos. Can we speak again? I want to do another story." So I will always talk to the media, as I learned from him, in a whole career as a university professor, I might have access to a few thousand students and a few hundred or a few thousand other doctors. However, if I get a story that's in a publication, it could be read by 500,000 or 1 million people. Or if I go on a television program, I've been on TV and, in the United States, I've been on TV in countries in Europe. That's where you educate the public at large, because people just don't know. I would suspect if you walk down the street of any city here in the United States and you stopped 100 people and you said, "Is asbestos still allowed to be used in the United States?" 99 of them would say, "No, of course not," when it's still a legal product. Education and scientific credibility. That's what Dr. Salikoff brought.
Muy bien, Dr. Fran. Quiero aprovechar y me pasaste hoy un dato muy interesante y podemos cerrar. Este fin de semana, me dijiste, se celebran las conferencias de ADAO. Tienes la oportunidad de invitarnos.
Yes, if anybody wants to join, there's a 2-day meeting starting Friday and then all day Saturday. The scientific program is Saturday. The ADAO website, just go to ADAO. It'll have the conference. It's free. It's online. Some of us will be there in person. I'm flying down to Atlanta to give a talk in person and to chair a session, and they're giving me some award. But most of the people around the world are going to join online, and it's Friday and Saturday. ADAO.
Asbestos Disease
Awareness Organization.
Awareness Organization.
Yeah.
Renata, ¿tú crees que hay más preguntas?
No, ya no tenemos más preguntas en el chat.
Bueno, doctor Frank, ha sido un extraordinario encuentro. Le agradecemos muchísimo su tiempo, su participación, su conocimiento, su sabiduría. Estoy seguro que enriquecerá a este grupo y a todos nosotros que estamos interesados en poner nuestro granito de arena para que México sea el próximo país en Latinoamérica libre de asbesto. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Muchísimas gracias, Renata.
Tenemos una mano levantada. ¿Le damos la palabra?
Perfecto.
Sayuri, ¿tienes tu mano levantada o no? Te estás despidiendo.
¿Sería posible en la parte técnica que le abriéramos el micrófono a Sayuri Gallardo, por favor? Era de aplausos. No es una pregunta, es de aplausos para el doctor Frank. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Y muchísimas gracias a todos.
It's been my honor.
Nos vemos en las próximas conferencias. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Bye bye.
It's been my honor. Bye bye.
Gracias, doctor. Un gusto conocerla.
De nada.
Colleague.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.